Hey friends, welcome back to Embrace the Question. It's time to get back into our Bible study for the week. We are in Genesis chapter 38. This is actually our 43rd lesson in Genesis. Can you believe that? We're closing in on the last quarter of Genesis, really. That we've just arrived at the story of Joseph. Things are getting good, and now we hit chapter 38 and we take a detour. We're going to talk about that. So I do have another video in the works. It's really getting close to done, I would say, and that's a chosen commentary on episode 5. If you've been following me along with The Chosen, and that one was a really good one. And I don't want to be chintzy on the video. I'm still learning how to make videos, if you haven't figured that out. And there's an art to doing it well, and I have the feeling that I'm somewhere still on the lower part of that learning curve. So I have a lot to do and learn as far as making good videos, but I'm hanging in there, still learning a lot. And what I've learned the most is that this takes time. Everything is a process, and I admire those guys that have people that do that for them. I don't have people. I have cats, and they don't do anything. So anyway, let's get into Genesis chapter 38. We are taking a bit of a detour, and we want to talk about the possibilities of why. Why are we taking a bit of a detour? We just got started with Joseph. He's been thrown into the pit. He's been lifted back up out of the pit and sold to the Midianites, who are en route to Egypt. That was the last part of Genesis 37. And now we're talking about Judah. All of a sudden, the story is interrupted. We're talking about Judah. And I think maybe that verse 1 gives us our hint, which is it happened at that time. So maybe the author just wants us to realize that this was happening in sequence with our Joseph story. There are possibly some other explanations. I read up a little bit about that just out of curiosity. One might just be holding up Judah next to Joseph. See, Joseph is maybe not the wisest, but certainly our most pure-hearted that we know of in the group of Jacob's sons. So he's kind of he's dad's favorite. We know that. But he's the goody two-shoes. He's the one that does everything by the book, does everything right. We're going to find that out, especially in the next chapter. And then there's Judah, the one who, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. And the lineage of the Messiah is going through Judah. And I think maybe that too is a reason that this is here. Because the author can show us that the lineage of the Messiah involves many. It involves a lot of imperfect people. It involves a lot of Gentiles. And it involves a lot of imperfect, immoral, if you will, Judah. And I found this personally quite hard to read. I read it first in the ERV, the easy to read version, and that helped. It helped to get it in there and circulating so I can figure out a little bit of what this meant. But let's go with it. It's a very graphic chapter. So let's see what we can do with this. Start out in verse 1. And it happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. Now we're going to learn that Hira is just a friend of Judah. And Judah likes to go visit Hira, an Adulamite. You might recognize that name because Adullam is the cave that David fled to in his sojourn away from Jerusalem. He's fleeing from Saul, running for his life, and that is where all the mighty men congregated to David before he was promoted, if you will, to his destiny of being king in Judah. So Adullam is a special thing for me. I don't know if you can see the poster behind me, Adullam School of Warriors. That was a school that I ran for a number of years that taught people how to be kingdom warriors, and I miss it very much. But Adullam is definitely a buzzword for me. All right, so he meets this guy Hiram, a certain Adullamite. And there Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Okay, so he goes into the daughter of a Canaanite. So he's following the footsteps of Uncle Esau here, and taking, not necessarily wise, but at least, I think he's taken her to wife, not just a prostitute, but to wife this Canaanite woman. All right, and she hasn't been named to this point, but she conceives and bears him a son named All right, and she conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. All right, now you might be interested in the names. So the name's means watchful, and Onan means strength or strong. So watchful and strong, and that is what she named the sons. Verse 5, yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. Now, Shelah, if we look over here at the King James, we will find out that his name means request. That seems short and to the point. Request. Let's see if we can blow that up just a little bit. Same as petition. Interesting. All right, so we have strength, we have watchful, we have strength, and we have petition. Just in case you guys see it in pictures emerge from that. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Okay, we have no details other than God stepped in and helped shorten his life. The author writes point blank, God put him to death. What does that really mean? Could have meant that God actually allowed the fruit of his labors to catch up with him immediately. Then Judah says to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up an offering for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. I told you there was a bit of graphic into this chapter. And sure enough, I think what's interesting here is that we see a custom that otherwise we're not introduced to until Deuteronomy 25, I believe it is. Deuteronomy 25, when that was the command to the Israelites. If your brother dies without an heir, then it is your duty as his brother to go in and give him, help propagate his seed. So the idea is you get his wife pregnant, but you don't get to keep his son, so to speak. The son that is born from that sexual interaction is not your son, it's your brother's son. So in effect, you are, quote unquote, in the eyes of the Lord, loving your brother and helping propagate his seed, but you are not taking any of his land or his future possession, if that makes sense. You're not getting the benefit of having the son yourself. And Onan didn't want to do that. He didn't mind actually performing the act. We've figured that out over and over, that guys typically don't. But when it came down to actually taking the responsibility, he didn't want to do it. All right, so he was put to death also. Verse 10. So Judah is running out of sons here. He's got one left named Shelah. That's verse 11. And Judah says to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up. For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained at her father's house. Okay, so Judah is now just talking. He's making empty promises. Go home, stay at your father's house. When Shelah grows up to be a man, then I'll give you to him and everything will be okay. He can propagate the seed of his brother. And maybe this is where some of the questions from the Pharisees came from when they approached Jesus and they said, if a man is married and he dies and his brother steps in and takes the widow, in heaven, then whose wife will she be? Those kinds of questions. They studied these texts. So I find that this is so off the beaten path from, say, Joseph. We just abandoned the story of Joseph, and now we're in this really R-rated soap opera with Judah, and it's not a great story, is it? It's not a great story. So he's just basically, Judah here is blowing smoke. He's afraid that Tamar is cursed and that he's going to lose his last remaining son if he gives her to him. And so he's just like, go home, stay at your father's house. Everything will be all right someday. And then he wants to forget her. But she's not going to forget. So in the course of time, verse 12, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, meaning when his time for mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. So she's resentful, and she's got something in mind, I think, for Judah, who has lied to her. She's growing more and more resentful, and possibly for due cause, right? She's been promised and promised and promised, and nothing's come about. Now Shelah he's old enough to be married, and Judah has done nothing. Okay, that's where we're at. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, and she was sitting at the gate of a different town, so he had no reason to suspect that she was a relation of his. All right, and he turned to her at the roadside and said, come, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me that you may come into me? Playing the prostitute, right? And he answered, I will send you a young goat from the flock. And she said, if you will give me a pledge until you send it. All right, first of all, you're hiring a prostitute for livestock, okay? These are not modern times. This is, I'll give you a goat. I don't know why that's funny. Okay. But she's like, okay, well, you don't have your goat with you, so what else you got? I need some collateral here. And so he said, what pledge will I give you? And she says, how about your signet and your cord and your staff that's in your hand? So your signet is the men of the family often wore, if they were old enough to do business, they wore a signet ring, a wax signet ring, and much of the time they would hang that around a chain on their neck. They wouldn't wear it for whatever reason. Maybe they would. Maybe that was It was rare for them to actually fit. They would lose them doing the types of work they did, or they were just brittle, and they would lose them that way. So what they would do is they would put them on a chain, wear them around their neck, and that way keep them. And that's what she's saying, your signet and your cord, your signet and your chain, and your staff that's in your hand. Now I'm reminded here that Judah is he is the king tribe, right? He's not the oldest, but he's the king. He's the king bloodline. The messianic bloodline flows through Judah, and it's later prophesied the scepter will not depart from Judah, meaning this authority will never depart his bloodline. Interesting, because he's loaning that staff to a prostitute at the moment. Okay, so he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. Again, verse 20. So she goes back to her father's house. And when Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adulamite, to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim at the roadside? And they said, no cult prostitute has been here. So he returned to Judah and said, well, I've not found her. Also the men of the place said, no cult prostitute's been there. Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat and you didn't find her. So he's really not worried about the repercussions or the ramifications of his deeds. He's embarrassed by what men might think. We shall be laughed at, verse 23. But he has no conscience towards what God might think. He has not yet brought God up in this entire story. We're viewing two opposite ends of the spectrum here with Joseph and with Judah. Joseph, who we'll find out with Potiphar's wife, you remember the story. He wouldn't even be caught in the room with her after he found out what she was about. And Judah seems to be willing to sleep with anybody that'll sleep with him. Just trade a goat. Interesting. Okay, so verse 24, about 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Oh no. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Now, lest you think that's harsh, because the penalty by the law was stoning. Apparently, by the criticality of the sin or the rebellion, it was stoning plus burning. Okay? This seems a bit harsh. The law has not been handed down, so we're not following a code that is governmental in nature. This is something that is apparently up to Judah. And Judah walks in self-righteousness. He has zero remorse about being immoral himself, unless he is just trying to cover it up with punishing immorality in others. There's that possibility. All right. But, verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah identified them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not know her again. Okay, so now we find out immorality across the board, including incest. Justified? You could talk about Tamar's justification. Judah has none. Judah is just an immoral dude. And Tamar is a vengeful, reprehensible. All the adjectives really fit into this family. And yet this is what the author wants to convey to us, that all this mixture created a line from which the Messiah would come. What conclusions can we draw? We'll talk about that here in a second. So Judah knows that he can't escape the identification problem. I mean, it was his signet, it was his staff. He was caught. Everybody knew it. So he couldn't get out of it. He just admitted it. She's more righteous than I am. He's probably right about that. And when the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. That always seems to be the case. You know how twins seem to skip generations? Like, I have twins, and my wife's grandfather, I think grandfather was a twin. So in our case, it might have skipped 2. But there are a lot of twins listed here. It seems like there are twins everywhere. Jacob and Esau, I believe, were twins. They came out at the same time. They were fraternal, not identical, obviously, right? Okay, the twins thing is of interest. But there are twins in her womb, and when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore, his name was called Perez, or breach. So they're fighting for position in the womb. And Perez wins in spite of the attempted hitchhiking thing from the other one that actually has the scarlet thread. Okay? Is this confusing? It's confusing. Verse 29, but as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she says, "What a breach you've made for yourself." So his name's called Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. All right, so let's verify these real quick. We'll go to Perez, which is breach, I think. Break, to break forth, to breach, yes. All right, and Zara, which is rising of light. The rising of light, from Zarak, the rising of light. What do you see in that? Scarlet thread goes to the one that is the rising of light. Sure seems like very similar to the story of Rahab, right? Or Rahab, who hangs the scarlet thread, the scarlet scarf, cloth out of her window in Jericho, and she and her house is spared. That's what it's reminding me of. What do you think about that? What pictures are you seeing? Because there are pictures there. And I would love to know what you are seeing. Now, as far as this idea of the messianic lineage coming through this seemingly cesspool of an event, an event in Judah's life, what does that tell you? It tells me that the involvement of the nations was always somewhat integral to the story. Jesus came with this, to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles, but he always had time for the nations. He always had time to go across the sea, throw the demon out of the man at the Gadarenes, or he had time to make his way into Samaria and minister to the Samaritan woman, or he had time to heal the woman who claimed that she was a dog that would get the crumbs off of his table. It was always right on the periphery. because it was to the Jew first and then to the Gentiles. This light that was going to break forth was to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. When Stephen was stoned and Paul had his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, then there was another breach. And that breach brought light to the Gentiles, the nations, and the entire blessing of Abraham. I will bless the world through you, comes full circle. And it's just an amazing thing from which all of that emerged, isn't it? Well, I honestly don't know if you enjoyed that one or not. That's a pretty graphic story. But it's one, and honestly, there's not a lot of times that you'll find that preached from the pulpit either. It's just too graphic almost. But there's definitely some meat in there. There's definitely some things that are worthy of our attention. Again, I'm very interested in any types and shadows, pictures that you saw in that passage. Put them in the comments, because it's going to be one of you guys that really draws the really good stuff out of that one. It's the glory of God to conceal a matter, the glory of kings to dig it up. So let's do a little digging on that and see what we can find. All right. Hope you enjoyed it. I did. You guys have a great week, and I'll see you soon. Peace.